My name's Cheryl Butler, and I have been involved with God's House Tower for a little while, helping them with their historical background to their exhibition. And then I also got the job of writing the book, which goes with the story of the tower. So what I'm going to try and do today is give you a little bit of background as to how I approached writing the book about God's House and what got me interested in history to begin with. Because I, like a lot of people, I did history at school. I absolutely loved it. It was my favourite subject. And then when I was doing my A-levels, we got a new teacher who were doing the Tudors, as a lot of people do. And he gave us a topic to do in the holidays, which we were absolutely appalled about. But that was to go and look at what was happening in Southampton during the reign of Elizabeth I. And it was like a little light bulb moment for me, because up to that point, history had always been about kings and queens and battles and things that were happening elsewhere. And so it wasn't until I did that project and started to look at the archives in Southampton and what was held there that I realised, well, one, that Elizabeth I popped into Southampton on at least 3 occasions, and so did a lot of other people that I only sort of read about in books. So it started to make it really real for me. And so when I decided to do my degree in history, I wanted to approach it to really sort of be able to use local archives and tell a local story, as well as learning how to be a historian. So I did my first degree at Winchester University, and I then decided to go on and do my PhD at Southampton. And when you're doing your PhD, you have to produce, you have to write, you have to produce books. And one of my supervisors, Dr. James, suggested that I did one of the documents in the Southampton archives called the Mayor's Book of Fines. Little did I know what he was letting me in for, because it was a completely massive document. And one of my other supervisors said it was impossible to actually work with. But I managed it, and I produced a volume for the Southampton Record Series as part of my PhD, and then went on to produce 2 more volumes because there was so much to say on the book. And this is important when we get to looking at God's House, because it really covers that period of what was happening in Southampton in the late Tudor period and in a lot of detail. And so that research became really important when I got to the God's House project. So the next thing I did was in looking how to develop what I did with history after doing my PhD, was to sort of think about how to engage with a wider audience, because a lot of the stuff that you do write as an academic isn't that easy to access at times. And so I wanted to do what's now known as public history. And one of the earliest books I did on that was on Tudor Southampton. And so that gave a very illustrated idea of what Southampton was like in the Tudor period. And then my other area that I'm really interested in, because I'm a little bit obsessed with Jane Austen, is the Spa period, and she features a lot in that. So I did a book on the Spa period. So that is Southampton in what's called the long 18th century. And that became really crucial when we got to the God's House Tower book as well. So that's sort of the background about me and about my sort of research. And then to actually focus down on the book that I wrote, which is this one, Powder, Prisoners and Paintings. Obviously, it had to link to the exhibition and the plan for God's House Tower, and to make it a useful supplement where you could give a bit more detail to what was in the exhibition, because there's so much information and you can't get it all in the exhibition. But obviously you want to give people a flavour, and then hopefully that they want to find out more. So the A-Space team had decided that their main themes were going to be about the tower's first life as a gun tower, and then its second phase, which lasted about 150 years in the 18th and 19th century as a prison, and then of course reflecting the fact that it was also an arts and heritage venue, how it appears in images and paintings. And so there were the main 3 topics I cover in the book. There is some more other information as well. So in doing that, I started with looking at the tower's development, how it was built and why it was built and what it was used for. And it was a really significant development in the defences of the tower because it was a purpose-built gun tower. And it was built as a gun battery so that you could have a whole row of cannons and other armaments that you could shoot people who were attacking your town, basically. And because at that time we were almost constantly at war with the French, it came in very sort of handy. But as well as really talking about the physical construction of the tower, I really wanted to talk about the people, the stories, the people who worked there. And so to focus on the stories of the gunners, the people who operated the guns that were in the tower. And this is where all my research that I've done on Tudor Southampton came into its own, because when you're researching back in that period, nobody leaves you a nice book saying, here's all the stories of the Southampton Tudor gunners for you to find in the archives. You have to go through many, many documents, picking up a word here, picking up a reference there, to put together people's biographies and stories. And so it had taken me about 10 years up to this point to actually research the town gunners. And I'd been putting all that information on a database that I look after, which has everybody who lived in Southampton between 1485 and 1603. And you can find that online. Just Google Tudor Rebels and it will come up and you can search it yourself. So I could go onto that database, I could pull out all the people who identified themselves as gunners and look at what their lives were like. And we wanted, because we couldn't tell the story of all the gunners, was to find the stories of 4 gunners who had different backgrounds and different experiences to show what it meant, you know, to become a gunner. Some were professional, had been in the army, and they were brought in because of their specialist knowledge. But as time went on, they became people who worked on, if you will, sort of like temporary retainers for the town, and they had other things that they did for a living. So, for example, Peter Breen, he was a glazier. That meant he made windows. He was a painter. He was a musician, and in his part-time, if there was trouble, he would go down and operate the guns in God's house. And we know a lot about him. We know about his family. We know that he was originally from the Low Countries, probably Holland. And we know a lot about his business activities. So there was enough in his story that we could then put that in the exhibition. And so he's one of the featured gunners. One of the other ones that might be of interest at the moment is a man called Henry Peach, and he was a sailor. So he mainly operated guns on ships, but when he was on land, he was available to help out with the guns at God's house. He was a little bit of a disreputable character in many ways. He's always getting into trouble. But interestingly, one of the things I found out about him was that in 1603, there was plague in Southampton. And a lot of people, if they wanted to move around, had to get a license to travel. And the town hadn't really, plague hadn't really arrived at this point, so people could still move around. And so he got a license to travel and took himself, his wife and his 2 children off to Hamble. That's not so very far away. And he came back sort of about 2 years later when everything was clear. So that was how I looked at the story of the gunners and the gun tower. Then when we get into the early 18th century, they don't need the town as a gun tower anymore. So they're trying to think about what can we use it for, what can we use it for? Big thick walls, nice iron bars, very secure building. Our prison's getting a bit overcrowded, so this would make a good place for us to use as a town prison. And that is what they did. And the book goes into detail how that happened. And there were 3 prisons that were moved there. That is the debtors' prison, the felons' prison, and the bridewell for people who had just minor offences. And so we look at all those sort of aspects, both in the exhibition and in the book. But again, I wanted to bring it alive and look at some actual people, who were the prisoners. And it wasn't so easy as finding the stories of the gunners, even though that was quite a challenge at times. because a lot of the people who were put in the tower were illiterate. They were usually quite often from the lower echelons of society. And in the records, they didn't tend to say, oh, you know, John Smith is in the tower, he stole this is what he was up for, this is how long he was in here. Quite often they just would say, oh, there are 10 prisoners in the tower. There are 4 in the felons, 1 in the debtors, and you wouldn't really know anything about them. So you really had to sort of search to find them. So you were more likely to find stories about the debtors because often they were educated people and they could write things down. So they come into the story because they're always complaining and they're writing letters to the town council or to their lawyers or people about why they should be left out, they shouldn't be in here, trying to get money together to get themselves out of the prison. So that's how you can sort of, find out a bit more sort of 3D pictures about the prisoners in the debtors' town. We feature one, particularly John Egan, who was in there for a very long time. Normally people are only in there for sort of months. He was in there for getting on for 3 years because he had money, but he couldn't get hold of it. His money was in the West Indies where he owned a plantation, and he needed that to be sold to get the money to pay his debtors and to get out of the prison. He must have got a bit bored while he was in there because he agreed to educate the jailer's daughter and educated her in a perhaps not the way her parents were thinking, because she ended up pregnant and had an illegitimate daughter. There is a happy ending though. They did get married when he was eventually released from prison. So it's a really nice sort of tale to sort of see, how he coped with being in prison, what the effects of that were on him, and this relationship he had with the jailer. And the jailers are the other people who we can find a bit more about as well, because again, they're keeping some of the records. They have a life outside the bounds of the prison, and so we do know a bit more about the jailers as well, so we can talk about them. The third element in the book, main element, is the image of God's house and how it's portrayed through the sort of centuries. So initially you'll see it appearing on maps, the map that John Speed made, the map of the town, also a square drawing of the town. It's very clear to pick out. But it really comes into its own during the 18th century again, because Southampton was a spa town, and as I mentioned, I'm very interested in this period because of the links with Jane Austen. She often walked up and down the causeway outside of the tower, as did many painters and artists. And because Southampton had all these visiting artists who were painting these views, they were painting them not for themselves, but to sell to the visitors and to the owners of the posh houses in Southampton. And so you have people really at the top of their game. So Constable, Turner, they painted it. And then you have some lesser known artists like William Shea, still very, very good artists, and Thomas Hart Gray. And then the family of artists called the Pethers, who are famous for painting both daylight and moonlight paintings, which meant that they could perhaps sell twice as many paintings because you've got the daytime view, take the nighttime view as well. And people at this time were very interested in the Gothic. They're very interested in what they call the picturesque. And God's house as a building ticks both those boxes, and that's why it turns up in so many paintings, illustrations and engravings. And throughout the book we've used a lot of those images, as well as giving a bit of a focus to some of the artists who are working on that story. So the final thing I wanted to really sort of say is, when you're doing research on things like this, it's really important to go to the original documents. I use the internet and look up things as much as anyone else, but don't ever take that as sort of, gospel. Always go back to the original archives. And that's where we're really, really fortunate in Southampton, because we have such a rich archive of documents that are held in the Southampton City Archives up in the Civic Centre. And so I've given a couple of illustrations which to this talk, which you'll be able to see, showing you what a Tudor document looks like. And so one image is a list of people who are providing gunpowder to the town. So if you've got guns, you need gunpowder. And the second is the official document which records that Henry Peach has indeed been given a license to travel to leave the town for handball. And they look perhaps a little bit daunting when you first look at them, but it's you do get your eye in easily, and there are people who run paleography groups to help you learn how to read those documents. When you get into the 18th century documents, they're usually a little bit clearer and a bit easier to read, and so most people will just be able to read those from the get-go. So do go and have a look at some of the originals, and some of those I think will be on display in God's House for future exhibitions, so do look out for those in the events. So that's my brief overview of the book, which you can get online in the God's House bookshop. So when you're really sort of fed up and you've got nothing to do, you've got no excuse, because you can find out more about God's House Tower. I think what was interesting for me, particularly when I was looking at the prison, because I hadn't done a lot of work before on what prisons were like in the 18th century. And when they start off, it doesn't seem too bad because there aren't too many prisoners in there. And also the prison jailers used to have quite a lot of parties and rum was coming in, so it sort of seemed quite... But as time went on and things became more crowded, it was really unpleasant. And the other thing you need to sort of remember is that God's House is built over the old town moat, which is water that's coming in, has lots of rubbish thrown into it as well. So it would have stunk to high heaven, but it also would have been really damp. Mm-hmm. And it's really bad when you read some of the prisoners who perhaps when they're only for quite a minor crime and they pick up a fever. Thankfully, not many of them seem to have died, but some of them do. The other thing is the age of some of the prisoners. Children are in there as well. And again, what happens to some of them is that they are transported to Australia, which was a prison colony. And even when God's House first started as a prison, when we still had a colony in America, some were sent out to America as well. And I think the youngest I found was like 12 years old. So it's really young. And the other thing that shocked me is, because there are women prisoners in there as well, is that the doctor who was responsible for the prison said actually in many ways they were better off in prison because they were so malnourished that the main thing he had to do was get some decent food in them to really help their health. Because their life on the outside was so dreadful. I think it was pretty standard and pretty normal. A lot of the crime would be petty crime that you wouldn't even get put in prison for today, but you'd be told off with a warning. But I think it was pretty sort of standard. Obviously, you appear to have more crime as a period goes on, but it's because the population is vastly increasing in the 19th century. So I don't think that they are very different. You get some crimes that are more specific, so smuggling on the coast. So there are more crimes of that nature sort of happening as well. Southampton was the county town, so a lot of people were brought here to be tried. So in the swing riots against industrializations in agriculture, a lot of prisoners were brought to Southampton for their trial, so they would have spent some time in the prison. So again, it makes it seem there are more people there, but they're not just from crimes that happened in Southampton. Very minor theft, but theft of very small items, because in actual fact you could be hung for anything that's valued over a shilling if they wanted to do that. Most judges didn't do that, and it wasn't standard. So theft of property was the main reason people were transported, and usually for 7 years. If it was more serious crime, like people in the riots, or if you were, if it was murder, it would usually go up in sort of 7-year increments. So people were like 14 years. The rioters could be a life sort of sentence if it was a very serious crime. Some people did come back afterwards. A lot of people just stayed out there and made a life for themselves after their sentences were complete. Quite a few people actually died on the voyage out there, or died in their sentence because, again, life was very hard. But for some people, they actually, if they could get past that and and establish themselves, probably ended up having a better life out there than the life they had left in some instances. I think it's because I read her books at a very impressionable age. We did Pride and Prejudice for sort of O levels. I was at like 14, and I just loved her books. And again, it was one of those things that I've discovered, quite by chance, that she lived in Southampton. And when you read a lot of books about her life, they either don't mention that at all, or it's very skated over. And so I sort of wanted to find out, what her life was like and who were the people she was mixing with. So it was through her that I then started to really look at what was going on in the spa town, who are these people she's mentioning in her letters, because she wrote quite a few letters while she was here. What was she, as a young girl? She came as a child, but she came when she was 17, which she writes in one of her, I think one of her letters, that 17 is the best of ages, and it's an age to go and have an adventure. So what's she doing when she's 17? She's in Southampton visiting her relations, and so what will she be doing? Going to parties, she'd be dancing. The town is full of a militia, and she loves sailors, loads of officers and gentlemen. She would have gone to visit Netley Abbey, that was very popular, and as I said, the walks around God's house. So it was sort of trying to see the town through her eyes that really made me look at it, and then to realise that it was such an important spa town. Again, something that's not known, because it when it stopped being a spa town, a lot of the spa towns sort of disappeared, so you're not aware of it as you are if you go to like Bath or Tunbridge. That it was at the time one of the top sort of bathing resorts and spa towns in the country. So it really was an interesting and again overlooked period of the town's history. In normal times, obviously at the moment all the archives are shut. Oh, it's so sad. But normally they're only open a couple of days a week, Tuesdays and Wednesdays. But you can just pop in, and the archivist's there, and they sort of help you. And you say what you're sort of researching, and they get the original documents out. So I've actually held in my hands these letters of people that are written from God's house, and someone write a poem about being in the prison, and you can actually sort of touch and feel those documents. A lot of the major collections are opening their collections up, and you can look at them for free. So it's a good chance to, if you are someone who's interested in research, to really look at the various websites, because there's a lot of stuff being put up there now to help people carry on researching while we're all in lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheryl, thanks so much. It's a really fascinating insight into a huge amount of history that's now, thankfully, all in one place, in one book.
Yeah, all in one book.
Thanks, Cheryl. That was wicked.
Okay then.
Cool.
Bye.
Thanks so much.